We continued exploring where is our strength from, looking at an enormous figure in the past, the female leader of the Jewish people, what it meant then, and what it means to us today. So we are in the middle of this concept that we've been developing of the amazing women, us. Who are we? What are we? Where do we get our amazing strength from? And we've been discussing this and really probing, going back into our history and seeing, when we go all the way back to Egypt, and as of course we've mentioned from a Kabbalistic perspective, our generation is a reincarnation. Yes, we believe in reincarnation. We are a reincarnation of those women. So we are literally the empowered women who created the fate of the Jewish people, who created redemption by their belief in it, by their pain, the pain of exile, by their belief in joy and redemption. We did it, and we're doing it again. So continuing our little trip down history lane to understand women by looking at women, we said that even though in the Torah portion that recounts the splitting of the sea and the men's 19-verse song and the women's 1-verse song, but God favored the women's, we had the tambourines, the drums, the dance, and we said this was a whole body expression of our joy, and this showed our preparedness, because we knew God wasn't done. We knew the Egyptians were going to be vanquished, and we were ready to thank him. And because of that, because the dance and the musical instruments expressed this deeper pain, deeper belief, deeper joy, that was the pivotal song in this Torah portion. Meaning you could say the women sing for 1 verse, I mean, probably they did more, but 1 is recounted, and the men for 19, maybe they did more also, but 19 to 1. But how do we know that God favored the song of the woman? In a very interesting way. And Chava once actually wrote this on our WhatsApp group, the concept of the Haftarah. And where does that come from? So we say Haftarah. That's the Ashkenazic pronunciation. In the more modern Hebrew, it's Haftarah. Haftarah does not mean half, like half maybe? Torah? No, the word actually isn't Torah with some syllable in front of it. It's a totally different word, spelled a totally different way. And it is something that all Jews have accepted upon themselves, a little murky, the original roots, but the understanding of the sages is that at a certain time, some believe this was during the time of the persecution around the revolt of Hanukkah, the ruling, persecuting non-Jews said, no more reading Torah. Capital offense. So the clever Jews said, we got to do something. And the sages at that time selected for each Torah portion, what do we find in the prophets that most expresses the theme of this Torah portion? And that's what they selected, and that's what they read. So the Jews would gather in synagogue, they would pray, and they would read from the scroll of the prophets. And they did this for however long they did it until this decree was rescinded. So when the decree was rescinded, you think, oh, okay, now I'm going to go back to synagogue and it'll be like it used to be, and we're going to read the Torah. But our sages said, wait a minute. There's a rule in Judaism. And the rule in Judaism is we only ascend. We never go down. We only go up. So if we took selected portions of the prophets and we said every week we're reading them in lieu of the Torah, we can just drop them on a street corner. It's going down. These portions of the prophets were elevated to the stature of being read in synagogue. They're very rarely nowadays. Most synagogues, if you ever would peek into the men's section, the person that's reading the Haftarah is reading it from a prayer book usually. But there are actually some synagogues that read it from a scroll. And the person reading it is like the person reading the Torah, as it was originally. So we can't just take these portions of the prophets and say, okay, back to the bookshelf with you. So therefore, we do both. We read the Torah portion and we read a generally short portion from the prophets that expresses the essence of the Torah portion. So very fascinating, but for us feminist women, it makes so much sense. when we read the Torah portion of the song after the miracle of the sea, with the 19 verses men's, 1 verse women, the Haftorah, the portion of the prophets that's expressing the essence of this portion, is the song of a woman. It's the song of Devorah. And that shows us that this woman's song is truly the essence energy. And that's why the sages did not pick the song of a man. There are many. They could have picked, like we read on Passover, the song of David. No, they said it's a woman's portion. It's a woman's song. It's a woman's victory. And therefore we have Devorah. Now, Devorah, if you have not heard of her, of course, it's a Jewish name, Deborah, Debbie, Deborah. Devorah was a very strong woman. She was the leading Torah scholar of her days. She was the judge. Now, this time period, just for those that didn't get the greatest historical understanding of these early times of the Jews, we're in the desert for 40 years, right? We become a people, we leave Egypt, we become a people. 50 days later, with the giving of the Torah, we spend 40 years in the desert. We come to Israel. When we first came to Israel, the leader was Joshua, Yehoshua, the primary student of Moses. What happened after he passed away? After he passed away, the Jews went into a very interesting period of reign called the time of the Judges. Now, for those of you that were in our class when we learned together the book of Ruth, which was a wonderful number of sessions, and it was really great learning. If this series on Ruth sounds interesting, I'll put a link in the description where you can access the whole playlist. So in the beginning of that, I explained this concept of the time of the Judges. So many of you probably know it very well, but in case everyone wasn't there or doesn't remember, just a brief overview. At this point, the Jews are still really holy, really connected to God. And they had not yet established a monarchy. The monarchy, in a sense, is a commandment. It's in the Torah. Laws about a king. So obviously a king is part of the grand plan. But originally it was almost viewed as a lessening in the Jews' relationship with God. So at this point, they're still good enough that they don't even need an official reign. They can be ruled by a judge, meaning a judge has spiritual laws. This is a spiritual judge. This is a Torah scholar who's judging the people. He doesn't have an army at his disposal. He doesn't have any real political clout over the people. But the Jews, in a sort of voluntary basis, are listening to him because they recognize his spiritual supremacy. And very often these judges went out to war and led the troops because it was sort of a pattern in those days, which is the Jews start slipping, they start behaving like the nations around them, they start maybe even intermarrying or start copying the styles, the customs, the mores of the nations. And God very quickly says, oh really, you're abandoning me? Let's see what happens. And then they lose their political strength, and one or various nations around them take over and start oppressing them grievously. Economic oppression, physical oppression, very, very intense persecution, which of course is a reminder call. Oh God, where are you? I was waiting for you to remember me. And then the Jews repent, generally through the guidance of a spiritual leader. And with that spiritual leader's help, they repent, they return to God, and then they have this miraculous victory one way or another, go out to fight, win over these people that have been ruling them for however many years, and achieve political autonomy until they forget God again, and the cycle begins once again. So very often, these reigns of the judges were sort of short, because when the judge stopped ruling, then the Jews would forget, they would slip, and then they wouldn't have any autonomy, so there was no ruler because they were under the nations. And then somebody would rise up and would be their spiritual leader, bring them to repent, go out and fight, and they would have this spiritual and therefore political strength usually until the end of that judge's lifetime or when something happened and the Jews left serving God. Though usually they stayed faithful under that judge. So very often these periods of the judges were short and the periods of the Jews' faithfulness was short. But there was one judge who was so powerful that the Jews remained faithful and strong for 40 years. And that judge was a woman. And that woman was Devorah. So any of you know anyone whose Jewish name is Devorah? That is a very strong name of a very strong Jewish woman who thousands of years ago led her people, not by birth, by being recognized as the judge of her generation. And as happened previously, again in her times, she brought the Jews to repent and she said, okay, we're going out to fight war. Now she said, I'm going to stay home. You men are going to fight war. And the man that was appointed the general said, no, we're not going to fight unless you come with us. We need your strength. So she went with them. They fought the war, incredibly successful, because of course, when you're with God, God responds, and he does within nature and beyond nature. It's actually very interesting in this story. I'm just going to recount again, because very often people don't really understand how strong the Jewish woman is. And we see this in our roots, in these stories of these very strong Jewish women, what is expected of a Jewish woman. So this Jewish woman, Devorah, led the Jews. At the same time, another Jewish woman played a pivotal role in this story. So here we have the enemy vanquished and the general who had been savagely abusing the Jews for years. He was the general, but he was ruling this area. He's running away. His name was Sisera. He's running away. And as he runs, he's like, well, I've got all these Jews chasing me. I don't know what happened. These are the wimps, the weaklings. How did we become the wimps? I don't know what's going on. This is a crazy upside down world, but I got to find somewhere to hide just till they pass. And then of course, I'm going to come back with even more troops. He's running. He passes by the tents of someone that he knew was actually friendly with his king, a Jew, but who had made a peace treaty with his king. So he's like, oh, okay, they'll hide me. So he goes there. And at the time, the man, his name was Chaver, was not there, but his wife was there, Yael. And Yael sees Sisera coming. She understands the story. She says, oh yeah, come, Sisera, come. Are you looking for a place to rest? He said, I'm looking for a place to hide. Sure, of course, my husband's not home, but of course, what can I do? Hide me, no problem. She gave him some milk that made him very sleepy, but he was thirsty and he drank and he fell asleep. And when he fell asleep, this brave woman took the peg that the whole tent was pegged into the ground. And of course, the tent wasn't like if you're going camping. This was like their home. So this very strong peg, and she picked it up and very quietly she approached and she rammed it into his forehead. And she killed this vicious anti-Semite who had been persecuting her people for years. And then she went back to the entrance of her tent because she knew the Jews would soon be coming. And when the general of the Jews, whose name was Barak, was passing by, she said, I think I have something here. I think I have the person you're looking for. And he came in and he saw his enemy killed by this woman, Yael. So if you know any Yaels, that is also a very powerful, strong name of a very, very brave woman who knew this is what she was going to do for her people. And this is the Haftorah we read, because this was really the essence, energy, and especially because Haftorah has to do with a certain state of exile. Meaning, of course, when we have the complete revelation of the redemption, it should happen like today. Shabbos, we'll all hopefully be in synagogue. Come on, the first Shabbos of redemption. And in synagogue, maybe we'll all be in the temple, they're going to read the portion of the Torah and the portion of the Haftorah. We're not giving it up. But it's especially connected to a state of exile, because exile is the reason why we started this Haftorah, because of persecution. So that's sort of implying that especially in times of persecution, especially in times of exile, a strong woman's voice is creating redemption. So we're saying here's Devorah is this strong woman, reminiscent of Miriam and the strong women that left Egypt. Devorah was also known for two commandments, two mitzvot that she excelled in, as we see in the writings of the prophet concerning her. Very interesting. The two commandments that this judge, this woman that went out with the troops, this strong woman spiritually, morally, what were her two commandments? The candles and modesty. These were the two commandments that Devorah excelled in. Devorah says actually would make the wicks for the candles, for the lights. She would dedicate them to the temple. At that time, of course, it wasn't a temple, it was a tabernacle. But she was very dedicated to this commandment of the lights as we light them for the Sabbath, for the Shabbos, and for the holidays. And someday in that merit, she became the judge. And she was very modest. You say, really? I mean, I get that she was a really great woman, but it doesn't sound like such a modest role being the judge of the Jewish people. But we see how modest she was because in the hot Middle Eastern heat, she would never judge inside. Now, of course, according to Jewish law, you could. A woman could be in a room if there's enough men around, if her husband was present, if the doors are open. It's not forbidden at all. But she said, no, I'm not doing it. Okay, I'm going to judge outside in a totally open area. So there's no even trace of something which maybe would possibly seem to be inappropriate, seclusion with a man. Even though, as I'm saying, it's totally doable and not at all a problem. And there's many ways, according to Jewish law, for a woman to be inside her home with men as long as there's certain conditions in place that she definitely knew. But she said, no, I'm going to be outside. Okay. She didn't only go outside. She said, I'm only going to sit under the date tree, the palm tree. Why? Because she didn't want to sit with this hot Mid-Eastern sun beating on her. She didn't want to sit under some nice shady tree. She said, no. Even that could imply some sense of seclusion. I'm going to sit under a palm tree where it's really tall and the leaves are up there and there's no shade at all. That's where I'm holding court, which is a tremendous, again, required by the law? Not at all. According to the law, she could have been inside. She could definitely have been under a shady tree. But sometimes you have a sense, a feeling for a commandment, and you go way beyond the law because of your sensitivity. I remember once sharing with this class, I don't remember when it was, probably quite a while ago, about a man, a Chabad man, that under the communists was imprisoned for 20 years in Siberian labor camps. And for 20 years in Siberian labor camps, he never violated the Sabbath. Inhuman, impossible. Great rabbis were imprisoned and violated the Sabbath sometimes. Allowed according to Jewish law in those situations. It wasn't mandatory. It was his feeling for the commandment. Not worth it. No, I'm not going to live and violate the Sabbath. So similarly for Devorah, I'm not worth it. I'm going to go beyond the laws of modesty to retain such a modesty as I'm judging the Jews. So it's interesting. I thought it was very interesting that specifically these two commandments, the lighting of the candles and modesty, were the two ones that Devorah excelled in. Any thoughts on that? What do you think what does that seem to imply about these commandments? How would you relate to that in terms of Devorah, her persona, and these being her two symbols, these two commandments? Any thoughts? Ava?
Yeah, so a couple of things. If we're talking about candles, right, we know this is one of the main commandments that given only to women. I mean, primarily Shabbos candles, holiday candles. It's so the candles, one of few main ones, right? along with baking challah and family purity. And modesty is when we live, so she was a judge, so she was a public figure, my understanding, right?
Way ahead of her times.
Yeah. So for me, so I think to pick something that you can demonstrate Hashem's law in public, like being modest, it's like you consistently demonstrate this Hashem law in public. I think that's very, very strong.
Oh, wow. That's a nice thought. I wasn't even thinking that. So you're saying candles, because she was a woman, and this is the woman's, one of the 3 commandments that God chose women to fulfill, even though, of course, as we've learned, if a woman's not around, the man has to light the candles. And modesty is a very public way of really impressing on the people, to this degree you have to go to fill God's laws. Do I need to sit under a palm tree? No. Do I need to be under any tree? No. But to this degree, we should be connected to God's laws. It's really beautiful. Someone else, any other thoughts on why these 2 commandments, or what can we think? What do we learn? What does it seem to be teaching us about these commandments? Which, as Chava said, of course, the candle lighting is very much a woman's thing. And of course, modesty is applicable to men, applicable to women, but definitely we could view it as something definitely as women that we relate to in a very woman's way. So anyone else have any sense, any ideas on why these 2 commandments, or what does this tell us about these commandments or about Devorah?
To have a power, and at the same time to show that she is wise and not exceeding her power. This is a modesty come.
Oh, that's nice. So you're saying it was her way of sort of balancing, I'm this, as Chava said, public figure, and I'm a modest Jewish woman.
Right. To have all power, at the same time, she shows that in her modesty, this is her power.
Oh, so you're saying 2 things, or I'm understanding it in 2 ways. The first thing, Ellen, you said, I understood as like really being almost a role model. I mean, not that she was per se trying to role model, but definitely being a role model for us as like, be as out there as you want, and never lose your inner self, never lose your inner role. So you're the judge of the nation, and you're this very modest Jewish woman, as every woman strives to be a modest Jewish woman. And there's a synergy of that. And then you also said something else, that in the modesty comes her power. There's a power she's getting through that modesty. Very interesting thought. A power we get from modesty. Anyone else want to pick up on that idea, or the other idea that Ellen said?
Yes, I have other side of this. When we say modesty, I not exactly understand what maybe this you all ladies apply to. For me, modesty is the way we dress, the way we talk, the way we behave. But the idea, or not the idea, the fact that she was sitting under a tree and made herself, I don't want to say minimized, but smaller, it's more humbleness. I would say she was humble by doing.
You're looking at it that she was humble because she was under a tree and not in some official office?
No.
Appropriate for the role?
No. I'm saying being under, for the fact which you said, being under the tree, and you expressing it this as a modesty, I would say this is humbleness. Unless you would.
So it is what's said, meaning it wasn't my personal take on it. It's explained that that's why she chose to sit under that tree, to the degree that that tree became under her name. We actually call these palm trees Tomar Devorah. I don't know if anyone has heard that term in the Hebrew. Tomar Devorah means like Devorah's palm tree. From this
So what those palm trees did for her? Did they close her face? Did they obstruct her from people seeing her? What those palm trees did?
No, what they did, I guess I was not very clear. Thank you for pointing that out. Now, again, also historically, to put this in perspective, there's a whole set of laws about a woman and man not being secluded. Those laws had not been enacted yet. They came later. So at this time with Devorah, there is not one law in place stipulating any restriction on a Jewish man and woman being together, even for that matter, actually being alone in her home together. Nowadays, there are laws in place, laws that we can all understand very rationally, in terms of if a woman's going to be alone with a man, there has to be open windows, the door's open, the husband's around, or at least in town, certain number of men with a certain number of women. There's lots of laws to make sure that everything's considered like public, which again, in today's world, we can definitely appreciate. But Devorah was before all these laws. And she had a sensitivity, which is another interesting point here. This was not, as I'm saying, this was nowhere near anything of the letter of the law. In those days, she could have been alone with a man, it would have been fine. Nowadays, you can be in your home. If you have a worker, as long as certain stipulations are in place, it's also fine. You have to know the rules. But there's definitely many ways to do it according to law. She had a sensitivity that seclusion of a man and a woman doesn't feel right, doesn't seem modest. Also, generally, she's judging a case. She's not alone, her with one man. There's probably a number of people. There's the litigants, the plaintiffs, the defendants. It could be a situation when one man is talking to her privately. In her role as a judge, she could be counseling. She could be talking, maybe it was just one, or maybe it would be a few. Still, she felt a sensitivity to the issue. So she said, no, I want to be outside. I don't want any sense of seclusion with a man or men. Fine, that's very beautiful. That's very noble because it was pretty hot outside. But then she took it a step further and said, and I don't want to sit under a leafy tree. And that's why she chose to hold court. Her Beit Din, her court, was under the palm tree because the palm tree does not give shade. And the shade also could intimate some type of privacy, seclusion. And she felt, and again, this is purely very, very heightened sensitivity. This is nothing that the law requires. But she felt, no. And I think what Ellen said was actually a very beautiful point in this of, you could think a woman that's out there could almost lose this. You're out there, you're a woman among all the guys, you're actually the judge, they're all listening to you, you're the Torah authority, you're the one telling them to go to war. And maybe even because of that, who knows? Maybe because of that, she grabbed more tightly to modesty to make sure she didn't lose it. She didn't become unbalanced. She became a female leader, not like a man. No, she was a woman. And as the woman, she led them. And so that was the idea of the modesty. But I appreciate what you're saying about humility as well. I mean, there definitely seems to be a humility component, but it's very, very clearly written in the sages that she did it because of her desire to really maintain or strengthen this modesty. I think what Ellen actually said was something else very interesting, this idea of the strength. I think that's a very powerful thought. Here she was, a strong woman. This was not a time when the judge is a man, the judge is a woman. No. She was the only woman judge during that era of our judges. And that was definitely not the rule before or after. She was a very strong woman, obviously a very, very, very brilliant woman, obviously a very, very learned woman, obviously a very pious woman. She was very strong. She was very strong. She wasn't the behind the scenes and propping up her husband as the judge. She was the judge. And it's interesting to think maybe these commandments gave her that strength. Maybe, as Chava said, the Shabbos candles are a woman's commandment, though of course a man will be obligated, as is the separating of the challah dough, as is a family purity. Modesty, though again, men are obligated, but it also seems a very woman's thing. At the same time, we're saying Jewish women are very strong. So maybe there's a synergy of these two ideas. Maybe our special commandments are really what keeps us very strong. Our very feminine commandments making us very strong females, strong leaders of our people. As we said in the beginning of the series, the woman is the mainstay of the family, of the home, and of the people. Seen in themselves any change, anything different in themselves or in their lives when they began or when they strengthened keeping either of these commandments or any other woman's commandments, I guess we could say, separating the challah, family purity, lighting the Shabbos candles, modesty. Anyone has seen in themselves a shift? Like we're saying, possibly these commandments give the strength. These commandments are a source of strength. Anyone has seen a shift in themselves or a shift in their life after they began them or when they maybe made an improvement in them?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I just have this image of Devorah being in Beis Din as a judge. So my question is, today, we don't have any women in Beis Din, right? Because women don't get as a proper education to serve in Beis Din. Isn't that right?
Absolutely true.
Yeah. So she definitely, like you said, she was so far ahead of her time. That
So
this
different
time
from her time.
yet.
There is a concept of women being what's called, the closest you could get to it, I guess, is called a to'enet, meaning in the modern, we're going to today's times to understand, in the Bet Din, in the Jewish court system of today, as Rivka's saying, it's rabbis. So a Jewish woman she can't be a rabbi, so she can't be on the Bet Din. But what she could be is, I guess the closest term we could say for it is the lawyer in the case. There's no official lawyers in the Bet Din, but there is a quasi-lawyer called a to'en, the person who's maybe running your case, speaking to the rabbis on your behalf, or being your spokesperson and your lawyer, your counsel. So that counsel, there are women today that train for that role as well, to be, they call it a to'en is in the male and to'enet is the female counsel in a Bet Din. But to be literally on the Bet Din, no, because by definition you can't be on the Bet Din because you can't be the rabbi. But it's okay, we'll lead in different ways. Going back to my question, anyone, any experiences where you've seen a shift in yourself, in your strength, in your life, in something where you can see how these commandments gave you a strength, changed you?
When I started doing those commandments, I definitely felt that I can say that Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah are my matriarchs. You know, I really felt that I kind of like earned it. You know, just that that there is a link that I finished. Because like for a lot of Russian Jews, our parents weren't able to keep commandments. So I felt when I started to keep commandments, I just reached out and grabbed that link. So that
you did.
Yeah.
Very often when I speak to women, let's say about lighting the Shabbat candles, I say exactly that point. I feel it very strongly also. I say there's this unbroken chain. It started with Sarah. We're told Sarah lit the candles, Sarah separated the challah, Sarah observed the family purity. It started with Sarah, and it's been an unbroken chain. And if there was a break in the chain for one link, two links, you can reconnect. You can close those breaks. You can attach yourself to that chain that goes all the way back to Sarah. Very true. Very true feeling. And that is a very strengthening feeling to know you're part of the chain. You hooked yourself back onto that chain of our people. It's a very strong feeling. Anyone else? Anyone else in any of these commandments of a woman or modesty felt different in herself, different in her strength, different in her security, different in her relationship with people?
Maybe a little different. What I think, we have certain very clear limits. I will call them limits. or rules or guidance, right? It's very good in our days because there's so much going outside in this crazy world, and it's easy to lose lose the perspective. What is beautiful, what is not beautiful, what's appropriate, what is not appropriate, right? So it's just a very crazy world out there, and I think it's helps us to stay sane, connected, appreciate the right values, and it's also, I really hope and believe that it helps our children also to differentiate what is true value and what is maybe something a wind that hopefully will just go away and just change. And so I think that's where I see how it helps me and in my viewing and connection with the crazy world out there.
I think you're so right. You're absolutely right. And that's a very different version of the word strength, but it's a tremendous strength. It's like lines, boxes. There's a framework. There's a frame of reference of who we are, what our role is, what our responsibilities are. And when you don't have those clear God-determined lines, like you said, it becomes a whim. We see this, I know the Bachelor spoke about this in terms of morality. He would give the example, of course, horrific example of Germany, that in the 1920s and the 1930s, Germany was viewed as the most cultured, sophisticated, morally, developed people. Germany was viewed as very sophisticated, high-level culture. And they descended to become the most animal-like, barbaric, totally any sense of morals and values, just like the most horrific low-level people. And what happened? And it's like you're saying, when there's no mandate from above, when it's just what a human decides is correct. So today it's morally correct to be cultured and admire the arts and theater and science. And tomorrow it's morally correct to genocide, take small children and smash them into the whip to horrific ways. And this I think is good, and today this I think is good. And then there's nothing. There's no ultimate God's rules. You're right. It's whims. And you're right. That is what we're seeing in our society in neon colors. And therefore, when we do have these very clear rules, it does give us a strength. The strength is the strength of we know what's correct and we know what's not correct. We know what's right and we know what's wrong. We understand God's vision of our role, all the ways we should be out there and all the ways we should be in there. And that is a tremendous source of strength, to actually know who you are and what you're supposed to be doing with your life. Because otherwise, you make stuff crazy. That is a very different perspective on it, and also a lot of strength. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on this? And how the commandments have changed you, changed your life? Maybe even as Chava is saying, giving her a clarity in terms of herself and the world. I'm putting some lines there as well. Anyone else?
It changed your priorities, I think. It changed my priorities in life. That your family and, we just living in too materialistic world, unfortunately. And generation before, like you mentioned in Germany and all this, money, money was too much power, and people felt that they so exclusive because of the money and all that. So by changing priority, and I think it brings more peace and understanding.
So did you feel any specific commandment gave you that clarity of which of priorities, or you think it was just sort of a general shift as you're serving God? It sort of places sort of prioritization on family and relationships instead of things.
I'm not religious person, but I think that we just living in too materialistic world, and unfortunately for many people, the money is everything, and it's wrong, and this is what
it's definitely our idolatry. It's actually interesting. There's an incident with the first leader of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, whose liberation we celebrated a few weeks ago in this class. And he was once discussing a concept that's recorded in the Talmud. It says in the Talmud that in the era between the destruction of the first and beginning of the second temple, that time that was called the Men of the Great Council. This very large body of great sages, 120 sages, that met and determined many things, sort of the new road in Judaism, how Judaism was going to continue in exile and now coming back to Israel and rebuilding the temple. It was a time of a lot of chaos and needed new roads. And they met and they put many things into place, seeing the new situations the Jewish people would have to encounter. And one of these things these men of the Great Assembly did was they prayed to God to remove the temptation for idolatry. And the reason they did so was because in the time of the first temple, idolatry was the Achilles heel. It's what the Jews kept sinning with. And they were actually on a very, very high level, the Jews in the era of the first temple, but they kept succumbing to idolatry, and that was their ruin. That was why the temple was destroyed. That's why they were exiled for 70 years. So the men of the Great Assembly prayed to God to take away this temptation. We just shouldn't want it anymore. Take it away from us. And God listened. Now, the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, said about this that everything in the world is balanced. Here, there's this great pulls toward God, great pulls away from God. And these sages are saying, take away idolatry. That's this huge pull. If God would just take it away, like the world is suddenly like out of kilter, not balanced. We don't have two equal pulls anymore. So it can't be that God just took it away, which is what seems to be written there. But at the same time, we definitely have no real desire to go and find some graven image we can start bowing or prostrating or cutting our hair to or doing whatever. So what happened? So he said, God removed from us the worship of these graven images, and instead he gave us an idolatry for money and possessions. So we don't have an idolatry. I mean, again, obviously there's some people that do, but we as a Jewish people, we don't have this strong, almost irrational desire to find some image and serve it. But we do struggle sometimes with not worshiping the dollar or the ruble or beautiful countertops or cars or a more luxury condo. Yes, that is the idolatry that the Alter Rebbe is saying we absorbed in lieu of the other one. Obviously, it didn't harm us as much as that did, but it still is a very, very strong pull. And as you're saying, and as the Alter Rebbe was saying, it really is turning to God, serving that idol of materialism. And as you lessen the hold of materialism, it's easier to have that sensitivity and appreciation for God. And as materialism becomes so chokingly strong, sometimes it's hard to have that same sensitivity to God. So you are definitely right. And definitely as one makes a step, one step toward God, a step in lighting the candles, a step in modesty, it starts loosening the hold of that other force of idolatry. Absolutely. Anyone else? Any other reflection on how these commandments have changed you and possibly strengthened you? As we see, Devorah was so strong and so stellar, so outstanding in these very feminine commandments, and maybe they were the source of her strength. Anyone else have any reflection on how these commandments have changed your life, changed your strength, changed your perspective on the world? I can definitely say for myself, I think a few things. I definitely feel that both of these commandments are really significant, especially significant. Of course, every commandment for serving God is significant, and the Shabbos is significant, and kosher is significant. There's, of course, we're not saying more or less, but definitely as commandments given to women, you feel should really want, they must have a real strong power for a Jewish woman. And it definitely feels very Jewish woman feminine to light the Shabbos candles. And I know for myself, I strive to light them early. My forte is not time, but I strive. I try to fool myself and say, well, envision Shabbos is coming, whatever. I try to calculate my day so I should be able to light them early. And I definitely can say that when I'm lighting them early and I'm lighting the candles, I definitely feel something, some holy energy penetrating the home and me. And as Rivka said, definitely feeling that sense of linking back generations of my ancestors that did the same thing. So it's a very beautiful and very powerful moment. I think for myself, like probably for many women, we all have to work hard on modesty. It's so easy to lose it. In a sense, of course, as Miriam said, well, modesty is, your elbows and your collarbones and your knees. And of course, that's true. And then as we're saying with Devorah, modesty is being modest while at the same time being out there in the world. Devorah was really out there in the world, but she was really modest. And I know for myself, I sometimes find that struggle of being there and being reserved, and that dance of those two movements. And really, really, again, feeling that very, going back to your roots, that very good Jewish sense of me in line with all of them, all the Jewish women before me, when even as you're out there, you're still inward. And it comes up sometimes in very subtle little things, and sometimes in more overt things. So there's always levels of challenge. I also know for myself, each time as I upgrade my modesty over the years, I always feel it. I always feel really the impact, oh, now I'm starting to do this. And I just feel the change. Now I'm more careful in this. I feel the change. I feel the change both in terms of the strength of it, the relationship to God, and something else that I see with myself. And I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but each time as I'm upgrading in terms of how careful to be, I see my eyes get more and more sensitized to modesty. Because a lot of modesty has to do with sensitization, feeling this is wrong. Just of course, what are we to compare? But I'm saying Devorah had the sense of, it just doesn't feel right being in the home. It just doesn't feel right being under a leafy tree. I'm not comparing myself to those levels. But each time as I take on another extra level in modesty, I see my sensitivity to modesty grows. And I feel that when I was following the laws, thank God I was raised in a home where I knew the laws and followed the laws, but without being extra careful, I think there was a lack in the sensitivity. Sensitivity is a very precious thing. And going back to what Chava said about our world, it's very easy in this world to be bombarded by so many other messages that it's so easy to lose a sensitivity for modesty. And I just find for myself that each time I upgrade, it's not only an action, it's not only an external care and clothing, or it really, really turns inward and heightens my sensitivity to the whole concept. And just in terms of relationships, talking to a man, interacting with a man, I just feel a different level of sensitivity each time I upgrade the performance of the commandment. I think that's how I would say I really see the change in myself as I'm doing these commandments. Anyone else? Any other thoughts from anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you so much for all the input. It's always so nice to hear voices and glean from everyone's perspectives and experiences. And to be continued, and we will conclude next week, understanding where our strength is coming from. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.